O God, be gracious to me, a sinner, and have mercy on me. Blessed is our God, now and always, and forever and ever. Amen. In peace, let us pray to the Lord. Lord, have mercy. For heavenly peace and the salvation of our souls, let us pray to the Lord. Lord, have mercy. For peace in the whole world and stability of the holy churches of God, and for the unity of all, let us pray to the Lord. Lord, have mercy.
It's nice to see you all this evening. I was very glad when Father Anthony invited me to come and speak, not just because he's a dear friend, but because there are people interested in this topic, which is very near and dear to me, especially now that we're kind of crossing over. It's Holy Week for the Western churches, and it's Lent for the Orthodox. And how does this play out, especially in mixed marriage family, is of interest these days when they're really the majority of the marriages that are happening in the Orthodox Church. So, before we get started, I'll tell you, I am a product of mixed marriage. My dad was Greek, Orthodox of course, and my mom still is Roman Catholic. My brother and sister are Roman Catholic to this day. Yes, it's rather strange at times, especially when they come to church and they sit there with big smiles and wide eyes, and when it comes time for communion, they sit there in the pew and they just kind of watch as everyone else comes up. But growing up in this way, I consider it now a blessing, even though it was rather a challenge, because there's two simultaneous aspects to this. One, you have the difference in denomination, and there are traditional aspects of our faith, there are cultural aspects of our faith, and there are, of course, a number of theological differences. But growing up in this type of household of having two different churches of affiliation and two different cultures can really create strain, not just on the children, on the couple. And extended family often plays into this. So the U.S. actually was the first country to have an Orthodox Catholic dialogue. And I'm going to focus mostly on Orthodox and Catholic relations because in the GOA, in the Archdiocese, is that 7 out of 10 couples are marrying outside of the Orthodox Church. And that majority is to the members of the Catholic Church. There are some marriages between an Orthodox and a Protestant, and even fewer of an Orthodox and someone outside the faith. Muslim, Jewish, so on. Most Orthodox, if they get married in the church, it's either to really an Orthodox or a Catholic member. So that's why we'll focus on these types of relationships. And Archbishop Yakovos was the first in the world to start this type of dialogue. And as a very forward-minded thinker as he was, in 1965, 14 years before the International Orthodox Catholic Dialogue, he set up a North American consultation, which was set to address the pastoral dimensions of Orthodox Catholic relationships sacramentally, with marriage, pastoral application, raising of children, so on. If we take a look at the guidelines, some of the recommendations began about mixed marriage and the raising of children in 1971. In those days, this was 8 years before my parents were married, the guidelines were there's a responsibility of both partners to raise their children in their respective church. Upbringing of children and establishing marriage as a stable Christian union was stressed. Mutually love and respect one another, also stressed. Now, one difference is in the Catholic Church, the couple is the minister, essentially, of the wedding, in that there's an exchange of vows. This comes from the ancient Roman practice of having vows. The Orthodox Church does not have this because we believe Christ, through the priest, is present in the sacrament. And the final guideline was that the couple should be married in the Orthodox Church by an Orthodox priest. Now, when my parents were married in 1979, they had Father Rocco, the Italian priest, and Father Gavalis, the Greek Orthodox priest, present in both churches. They got fully married in the Catholic Church, fully married in the Greek Orthodox Church. My grandparents were thrilled because the real wedding happened second. That didn't exactly phase out over time, but for my parents, both marriages were valid. It's important to stress here that even taking into consideration 70% of the marriages happening with a member outside of the church is alarming, we could say, they're still getting married in the church, or to a member from a Trinitarian church, and particularly the Catholic Church that we see as our sister church. Marriages, up until about 10 years ago, there were about 50% of couples seeking marriage as a long-term goal in their relationship, and divorce was about 50%. Couples seeking long-term relationships are now down to mid-upper 30s. Same thing with divorce. You want to know why? Cohabitation. I know for me, I look at my generation within both sides of the family, and I'd say 9 out of 10 cousins were just living with their boyfriend or girlfriend, sometimes for years before getting married, often getting married outside the church if they did get married. And this is seen as an easier solution instead of having to think about divorce down the road. It's easier financially, it's easier with commitment. My generation and beyond doesn't like commitment very much. Even with children, nothing saying you can't have children just by cohabitating. Hey, you can share insurance, and so why not? Why do we need to get married in the church? What, just to make our parents or grandparents happy? That's old news. So we should celebrate that there are still marriages happening in the church, even if they are mixed marriages. And in some respect, especially if they are, because this is a bridge for church unity. We are called, at least as Orthodox and Catholics, to direct ourselves towards church unity, as this was the prayer of Christ. In John 17, verse 21, 22, that they may be one, even as we are one, meaning the Father and the Son, of course the Holy Spirit too. So then we fast forward to 1980, where the guidelines were modified slightly, and they were stressed to work against indifference and to take into consideration the role of the extended family on the marriage. Now, I don't need to tell any of you married folks that family can get involved in the marriage, for better or for worse. Families can be very supportive for a marriage. Families can really help a marriage to thrive, helping with children, helping financially, helping with housing until you get on your feet, helping with moral support, helping just to teach about marriage and how to overcome challenges. In the same token, families can also stress out a marriage. Even if it's a homogeneous marriage of a Greek Orthodox person married to a Greek Orthodox person, families can cause a lot of stress on marriage in general. And then you throw into that 2 additional factors. One, if there is a different church affiliation. Right there you have incredible strain that could be put on the couple, especially if they're both affiliated very strongly with their home church. If they're not, then this is less challenging, because if one is strong in their faith, the other's not so strong, it's likely that they'll go to whichever church it is. If they're both weak in their faith, then who knows? But then you throw into the cultural aspect. And I know very strongly from experience that the Greek culture reigns supreme. I'm very proud of my Greek heritage through my dad. It's something I'm most proud of, especially as it tethered me to him, and the short time we had him, it was something I still think of very fondly. Grew up wearing blue and white and not saying I was anything but Greek until I was about 13 years old, when I found out that that was not true. So clearly there was some distinction between culturalisms and the faith. Now, the Catholic side was much stronger in terms of church affiliation and faith, and weaker in terms of cultural presentation. The Orthodox side was very, very weak in terms of church attendance, faith. We went just for Easter. That was about it with our grandparents. It's about the only time that they went too, until after my father passed and they started going back to church. But the culture was very strong. All their friends were Greek. Greek was very important. I went to Greek school. And so we have this dichotomy. And how that played into marriage also was something that became quite strenuous on my parents, but mostly on us as children. Because, well, what side are you choosing? Are you Greek or are you Catholic? We're pinning culture versus church, culture versus faith. And the answer was, we're both. But it's easier said than done. This is very, very difficult for those of you here who might be entering into this type of marriage, or for family members you may have, how to support this. Because Statistics show that as you add some of these factors, as you add a different faith, as you add certainly a different culture or racial component, the stress on the marriage is one that not dooms it from the beginning, but really tests its limitations. And that there's often a lack of financial support from the family, a lack of support in raising the children, a lack of social supports, not just through the family, but also through church community. And the church has been seen as a form of attachment. When we're kids, we develop our first attachments, at least we hope that we do, with our parents. Attachment theory talks about how when we have a safe attachment with a parent, or a guardian, grandparent, we are able to explore the world around us. This starts when we're very, very small. Infancy, through toddlerhood, and then early adolescence. But mostly those first couple of years help us to feel like we have someone who's always going to be there, that we can start crawling and fall. We can start walking and fall. We can start speaking and fail. And that's okay, because we have someone who's literally got our back when we start to wobble. Now, when we grow older, sometimes our attachment shifts. We might be then attached to a spouse. We might be attached to a community. And our church communities are called to be this kind of safe attachment for parishioners, but also for couples as we get married and then grow in the church. Because marriage is difficult. Even raising children is difficult. And we all know the expression, it takes a village, and it really does. It's very, very challenging to raise kids, especially now with everything that we have coming at us. And we fast forward a little bit to 1990 when the recommendations for the pastoral care of mixed marriage, particularly Orthodox Catholic couples, started to develop a little more, where both the Standing Conference of Orthodox Bishops, now the Assembly Bishops, and the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops came together and said, we need to have resources for these couples. To this date, we're still working on resources, as everything in the church happens very, very slowly. So one of the recommendations was that either one of the priests or both of the priests be present, while still encouraging that the marriage take place in the Orthodox Church, because at that time, and up until very recently, if an Orthodox member was married outside of the church, even within the walls of the Catholic Church, they'd be seen as no longer in good standing. If we followed by the book, according to Katakrivia, as opposed to according to Economia in the church, we would say no communion, they can't be a godparent, they can't be a sponsor at the wedding, they can't. They could come to church and spectate, but that's about it. Until that was corrected, meaning until they came with their spouse and got married in the Orthodox Church. Until they corrected their mistake and got married where they belong. So, time went on, and we have different practices. There's often a stance, either, yeah, our churches are exactly the same, just one is in Greek and one's in English or Latin, or we're completely different, we're Orthodox, they're Catholic. The reality is, we have quite a bit in common, and the consultation, which is chaired on the Orthodox side by our Metropolitan, which I'm very proud to say, has worked diligently for decades to show we acknowledge and validate the sacraments of the other church. From initiation, meaning baptism, chrismation, following baptism that is, or in the Catholic Church as it's known, confirmation, to the Eucharist, marriage, holy orders, confession, holy unction. Theologically speaking, we see eye to eye. We say, those are valid sacraments, and they say, ours are valid sacraments. Don't get me wrong, there's difference in practice. The marriage looks very different. The order of baptism, and then separated by years in the Catholic Church for First Communion, which is kind of the age of reason. It's done, 6, 7 years old, and the first confession takes place before that, and then confirmation takes place often between 13, 14 years old, like a coming to adulthood, coming to manhood, womanhood type of timing, wherein, as opposed to our post-baptismal sealing of the Holy Spirit takes place for babies, or for an adult who's being baptized for the first time. So there are practical differences, and when it comes to particularly marriage, there are some theological differences that are notable, but we see eye to eye, and yet our churches are still divided. Now, while we won't go fully into that, that has mostly to do with the role of synodality in the Orthodox Church, and primacy of the Pope of Rome as the Catholic Church views it. It's really not based on sacramental differences. Now, when it comes to the actual sacrament of marriage in the Orthodox Church, the marriage can take place either in the context of liturgy if the priest gets a blessing from the bishop, or usually on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon, and there's flowers and all kinds of fun things. Mind you, even for Orthodox priests, marrying a couple that's Orthodox to Orthodox, we still need the permission from the bishop, because unlike the other sacraments, there are impediments that could take place that could prevent a marriage from happening. Someone could be married, from their home country, and that's why we have documentation that proves this person has the right to get married. They don't have a family in Greece or in Serbia, and they're getting married anew in the U.S. We also have to look that they were baptized in a Trinitarian church, and that they are in fact able to marry into the Orthodox Church. In the Catholic Church, it's a little different. You can have a marriage in the Mass, even with a Catholic and an Orthodox member. Even a Catholic and a Protestant could get married during the context of the Mass. There's another type of marriage that can take place with the deacon, not the priest, marrying the couple. There's even exceptions, while rare, that a Catholic could marry a non-Christian. Now, in the Orthodox Church, that's a completely invalid marriage, no matter who they are. They have to be a Trinitarianly baptized Christian. So let's talk about some practical aspects here. Raising of children. So what do we do as church community? Because, like it or not, and I know many people don't, this is not going away. And it's not like when my dad was growing up in the church where, aside from him and some others, most people married someone Greek and who was Greek Orthodox. I know the parish I'm serving, I'd say more than half of the marriages are Greek-Irish. So we have soda bread for St. Patrick's Day, which we did a few weeks ago, and some people wearing blue and white for Greek independence. So it's a mixed bag, but there's a lot of good that can come from that. A lot of opportunities amidst the challenges. So, the purpose of this dialogue is to help clergy, to help teachers, and to help the laity live a more full Christian life through the sacramental life of the church and in relationship to one another. So, especially now, let's take a look at our current circumstances. We're in Holy Week for the Western Church. Yes, I say Western because it's not American Easter and Greek Easter. It's not a Greek holiday, I hate to tell you that. And I grew up with my grandparents saying, "What are you doing for American Easter?" Well, the last time I checked, Jesus wasn't American either. It wasn't an American holiday. He wasn't the true patriot. It is, we can call it Western Easter and Eastern Easter, or Orthodox Easter, and if you want to elongate it, Catholic and Protestant Easter, because it's not a cultural holiday or an ethnic holiday. So, our Western brothers and sisters are celebrating this week. I hate to tell you this, to really blow your minds, but they're correct in their counting, yes. As Orthodox, we made a mistake. Our counting on the Julian calendar is incorrect for Easter. You can go back and take a look at that history, but just because it came first doesn't mean it was correct. The Jesuits did a fantastic job at creating the Gregorian calendar, which came out in the 1500s, and so it really takes into consideration the lunar cycle and leap years and how all of that factors in. To even where atheists, physicists, and astronomers like Neil deGrasse Tyson will say, "I will not argue with the Jesuits, and I will say in the year of the Lord because they did something that we cannot dispute today." So, for those of us who have family that are celebrating now and then will be celebrating in about 4 weeks or so, what do we do? Or what do we do throughout the year when we have, maybe some people who want to come to the Orthodox Church, but then mom can't receive, and then they go to the Catholic Church, and then dad technically could receive, but the Orthodox guidelines is that he shouldn't receive, even though the Catholic Church says he could. Our main responsibility, and yes, it is our responsibility for members of our community to nurture them, to be inviting, to be loving. But our church is called to acknowledge and to validate the other through our love, through our hospitality, which we're very good at. And Greeks are fantastic at hospitality. And for the children of these mixed marriages, to let them feel at home, even if they aren't Orthodox, to let them participate in the cultural activities, but also if they want to sit in on Sunday school, they're not committing any harm in learning about the faith through Sunday school. If they want to help sing in the choir, they're able to participate in these aspects, yet not fully being able to participate in the sacramental life, which can be challenging in and of itself, but we are called to be accepting. Metropolitan Maximus, of blessed memory, formerly of Pittsburgh, had actually said, since as Orthodox we believe, ecclesiologically speaking, that we have the fullness of the church, we should, this was his opinion, allow those who see us as having the fullness of the church to come in and receive and participate fully in the sacramental life. Because if we believe, as Orthodox, that we have full understanding of church, big C church, then why not? Why not allow them to come in if they have the fervor inside? And when I was speaking to a class recently, they said, yeah, but there's someone at the church who is Catholic and she's teaching Sunday school. She's in church and she's teaching Sunday school and she's always there. She's so close. Why doesn't she just become Orthodox? And the answer is, she doesn't have to. If her participation in the church is not impeded by her inability to receive the sacraments, and she's still connected identity-wise, because as we grow up, our faith is a very strong part of our identity. I'm not using identity the way that we use today, where we can change it, haphazardly. Our cultural identity, our religious identity, our racial identity are part of us. And so if we grow up Orthodox, or if someone grows up Catholic, this is part of who they are. And so just saying, oh yeah, but come to our side, we have the fullness of the church, this is undermining a very important part of them. It's like saying, oh, you know what, don't be Greek anymore, be Italian now. Could you imagine? Would any of you say, yeah, okay, non obligimano? I don't think so. So we have to understand that there's more than just meets the eye. And the worst thing we could do, if any of you have children or grandchildren or brothers or sisters or friends who are getting married or who want to marry, and they want to marry someone who is not Orthodox, don't force conversion on them. The whole dialogue that's full of Orthodox members, including our Metropolitan, the goal is not to say, you need to become Orthodox in order for us to continue talking to you. In order for us to have a relationship, you need to be part of us. We can do this through love, through our relationship, without pushing conversion. Conversion should never, never, never be forced. Not by the future spouse, not by the family. Because you know what? You're doing the marriage. Don't do it. One of the ways in which I was able to grow up the way that I did, being baptized Catholic and now I'm an Orthodox priest, is because my parents didn't force one another. And I was the only kid to this day that I can speak of, that asked his mom to go to church twice on a Sunday. And I'm not patting myself on the back, it's more of respect for my parents, that I used to go to Mass and then say, Mom, can we go to liturgy? And I wanted to see my grandparents, I wanted to explore the Orthodox Church because I loved the church, because my father loved the church. And because he loved my mom, I grew up loving the Catholic Church too. St. John Chrysostom, our own St. John, mentions this beautiful verse. He's saying he, meaning St. Paul, does not say one spirit. He does not say one soul, for this is already revealed and is possible to anyone. This is speaking about marriage. But he says to be one flesh. Sharing unity of body and soul indicates that the spirit of marriage is indeed alive in the here and now, while simultaneously enlivening the future unification of heaven and earth. At another time, he says, when speaking on marriage, indeed the household is a little church. Therefore, it is possible for us to surpass all others in our accomplishments and esteem. Now, he was saying this as Archbishop of Constantinople, and as someone who well-respected monasticism, he was saying it is possible for a husband and wife to surpass all others by becoming good husbands and wives. So this all plays into that. Marriage from the Old Testament with Genesis, with the foundation of marriage for Adam and Eve, through the most notable couples throughout the Old Testament, all the way up to the time of Christ, his first miracle at the wedding feast of Cana, all the way to the end of the New Testament with Revelation, marriage is used as a symbol of heaven and earth, a symbol of unity of creation with Creator, and of course within the marriage through sacrifice, through martyrdom, and through love and support for one another. So what's the good news? There's a document that came out by the North American Consultation. It was presented in November at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops with Metropolitan Halikias and a few others. Some of us who were part of the dialogue were present in Baltimore. And the new recommendations are as follows. One, for the present time that the Catholic party of the proposed marriage with an Orthodox be married with the Orthodox bishop or priest officiating after consultation by the partners with their respective priests and dispensation. Because the Catholic Church views marriage in the Orthodox Church as being fully valid, so for right now, until we work out matters with papacy and the patriarch and synodality, which could take some time, for now we ask that the Catholic side respect this. Now on the flip side, the Orthodox are also asked, through their hierarchs, that economy be given to these couples, and that for the Orthodox spouse, the purpose of his or her canonical standing in the Orthodox Church remain valid, reflected in continued Eucharistic participation and subsequent sacraments offered in the Church, meaning if they want to be a godparent, if they want to be a sponsor of the wedding, that they're no longer barred if they do end up getting married either in the Catholic Church or so on. That's big, because that allows people to be fully members of their church, so the Orthodox spouse to still partake in the sacraments, the Eucharist. Next, it's asked that the Catholic hierarchs seek ways to receive the pastoral decisions of Orthodox spiritual courts and hierarchs' decisions based on divorce. It's a major divergent point for Orthodox and Catholics. This is essentially saying that we ask for the Catholic clergy and hierarchs to respect the Orthodox decisions when it comes to divorce, because our divorce ends with an ecclesiastical divorce, which has a spiritual court. Often there's at least 3 priests that are present, and they kind of hear the case of the Orthodox spouse, and this is eventually decided by the metropolitan or local bishop. The Catholic Church views certain marriages as being dissoluble through an annulment, which means never happened. And you could say, wait a second, the couple has 3 kids. What do you mean it never happened? This happened through marriage, and their love and their family grew as a result of this. And there's all kinds of reasons, criteria for what constitutes an annulment and what can be accepted as an Orthodox ecclesiastical divorce. At the end of the day, both churches look at, are they already civilly divorced, which 9.999 times out of 10, that's already the case. I had someone who was divorced for 20 years. And then why do they want to get an ecclesiastical divorce? To get married again. The Orthodox allow marriage to take place in the church 3 times. Why 3? 3 strikes you're out, like baseball. Incidentally, a fun little fact here is that for someone who's getting remarried in the church, especially if they're marrying someone who's also getting remarried, there are penitential prayers added to the marriage, which I think if the priest added, the bride might throw something more than a bouquet at him. But nevertheless, that's part of our tradition. The next recommendation is that both churches exercise their responsibilities for the pastoral care of spouses and their children. So this is saying it's not just enough for the spouses to struggle and hope to stay married. Otherwise, we're going to go back to number 3, dealing with divorce here or annulments. It's that the churches need to be doing a better job at supporting the couples, starting with the hierarch, trickling down to those of us who are priests assigned to a parish, and then furthermore to all of you, family or not, as you see these couples in the church, to support them in ways so that they too may have an attachment to their church community. People see attachment to the church in good times, when there are marriages, when there's baptisms, even though these are usually with exclusive invitations, when there's funerals which are open to everyone to come, for times of stress, for joblessness or unemployment, for times when families just need support and someone to lean on, the church is often that place. The priests are often that person. The next is that the spouses in mixed marriage have a mutual recognition of their shared life in Christ and their assistance of each other on the way towards salvation. Yes, we both view marriage as a path to salvation. Now, there are days where you might not view your husband or wife as someone helping you to salvation, but we are called to be that for our spouse. And a good marriage makes the best type of parent. Because if your spouse comes first and you love them, and that outpouring of love then trickles down to your children, putting your children first, as I've seen even within my own extended family, often means that the marriages fail. And often men does fail. And then 6 and 7 are referring to further materials to be put together for mixed marriage, to support clergy in being educated, because I hate to say, except for an elective at the seminary, I didn't have any course that touched on it, except for our dear Father Tom, who taught the Orthodox Catholic relations before I did, and so we're not learning about this where we should be. And then we get into a parish, and 9 out of 10 priests, I think, would say, yeah, you should convert to Orthodoxy. And then we unwind everything that we've been working on for almost 60 years. But it's exciting that we are working on materials now. With the blessing of Metropolitan Halikias, we are moving towards the latter recommendations here to have resources for both the metropolis and for the Archdiocese of Boston. The Catholic Church helps that the Metropolitan and the Cardinal are dear friends and support each other in the ministry and each other's parishes as well. And then for the first time in clergy laity history this summer, there will be a panel discussion on ecumenical marriage and kind of what's going on in the Archdiocese and what we can expect for the future, which comes from, all of this work is rooted in the Ecumenical, Inter-Orthodox, and Interfaith Office in New York. So if you want to hear more, you can tune in. I did focus my dissertation on supporting Orthodox Catholic couples and the raising of children. There's actually a curriculum that I put together here for the purpose of supporting the couples as a support group, just like there are support groups for bereavement, for divorce, support groups for raising children or kids with special needs. I thought it fitting that the church have at least something to look to, just like we have the Department of Religious Education, as a support group that can be used for an 8 to 10 week session for couples to help them feel a little more acclimated in the church and to help them within their marriage and any trials and tribulations. Sadly enough, our pre-marriage seminar is the last one I did. 7 out of 8 couples were ecumenical future marriages, and 6 of those 7 were Orthodox Catholic. And so, again, we're working with the metropolis to try and have one designated for ecumenical marriages so that ahead of time they're getting some of this work, so that they're not entering into marriage and then saying, oh no, we want to, we're having a child and, our parents want Litigani to be baptized in the Orthodox Church, but we talked about him being baptized in the Catholic Church, now what?
So I was raised in the Catholic Church and converted, and I just feel like having more awareness about this within our church, can even be helpful to converts also, just because it would raise everybody's awareness of where our commonalities are and where our differences are, and in that sense maybe help the pastoral dimension a little bit, or the hospitality dimension, just with people being maybe not as familiar. Like you kind of grow up hearing certain things about other denominations or whatever that may or may not be accurate, and so you might have sort of a wrong picture about where that person is coming from or what their experience may or may not have been. I think it has wider ramifications even than just supporting the ecumenical marriages.
Absolutely. And sometimes my daughter will go with my mom to Mass on a Saturday. Obviously, she doesn't take communion or anything, but she comes home and she's like, Baba, why does communion look, the way that it does? And for the first time, I'm having to explain things that I took for granted. It's just knowing why they're different. We learn about controversies through the centuries of the Azamites and the Zemites, and who used yeast to have their Eucharist be leavened or unleavened, and where that comes from. And just these little things are important, because when things are veiled, and our theology is veiled, our practice is veiled, it's it's mysterious, not in a good way. And ignorance isn't bliss. I think it's just ignorance. So when we have people come to our questions or our churches, and we have church tours during festivals, and these are excellent opportunities, but to do more of this throughout the year. And as laity, you have a role too of sharing the beauty of our church in an educational sense, not in a proselytizing. Incidentally, this all began in 1920 with the patriarchal encyclical. It was entitled, "Unto All the Churches of Christ Everywhere." And this was really the turning point of the Orthodox Church in being the forebearer, really, in modern ecumenism. Yes, this started with the Orthodox. Our patriarchs, through the years, have been the biggest advocates for ecumenism. It's a shame it doesn't necessarily reach the parishes, but the Orthodox Church also helped to found the World Council of Churches and has been the longest standing member and has had a permanent seat, I believe, since 1955. And then all the work Archbishop Yakovos did here and so on. So as Orthodox, we believe in strengthening the ecumeny, the household of God. And if we believe that we have the true faith and the true church, it's our responsibility to share that and help to break down the walls that are dividing us as Christians. And next year, at least, we won't have the pain of celebrating the Lord's resurrection separately. And we hope that after 2025, which has been the hope for many years, that the Pope and the Patriarch can continue to work on at least us celebrating Easter together, the Feast of Feasts. So this is something to keep in mind and to pray for. Yeah?
Do you think there'll ever be a time when I'm Catholic, that I could take the sacraments in this church?
I do. So our Archbishop of Halikias has said, and again, it was his own opinion, he wasn't speaking on behalf of the church, but he said from now that he believes Catholics married to an Orthodox should be able to partake in the sacraments because of the nature of marriage, even if we're just using a little bit of logic. So you're telling me I can get married in the church, which is a sacrament, but I can't do any other sacrament? So the common cup actually reminds us that the marriage would actually take place in the divine liturgy. So it's not sacramental in and of itself, but it reminds us that the appropriate place for marriage and all sacraments is the liturgy. Because for the early church, really up until about the 10th, 11th century, marriage would take place civilly, and then it would be blessed in the church by the couple coming to receive communion side by side with the sponsor with the candles, and that would be the church blessing their marriage. So yes, I do believe in the long run you will be able to one day. If we look at numbers of Catholics in the U.S., it's a little above 60 million, at least as far as the last census. You know how many, we'll just stick to Greek Orthodox, there are in the U.S.? Practicing, a couple 100,000. So you don't have to be a mathematician to think, that's a big disparity. It's more than 60 times our population. It's better that they marry someone Catholic than the spiritual but not religious that we have so commonly, especially in New England. Come to clergy laity and voice your opinions, because this panel will be an open discussion, or if you can't go, tell someone who's going. Make a ruckus. Make sure that they hear that this is an important issue, and we need to allocate more resources as an archdiocese to this, because it's one of the most pressing pastoral issues in our church today. When it comes to sharing of the Eucharist and fully being in communion, there are many who are on both sides of the dialogue who will say sharing the Eucharist should be the end goal, not a means to the goal. Because in doing that, they say, well, we're foregoing the opportunity to address challenges that we still have as church. Essentially, the main challenge still keeping us apart is the role of the papacy as opposed to the patriarch who's in synodality. And things such as papal infallibility didn't come around until Vatican I, 1880s. As a professor at the school would say, in church terms, that's yesterday. It's really not very significant, but that's the driving force. If it wasn't for that, clearly the consultation has acknowledged the theological understandings of the sacraments as being essentially equal, again, given some practical nuances. So while the Eucharist could be seen as a driving force, especially for mixed marriage couples, it's seen as kind of cutting to the end before addressing everything.
Yeah.
But I share the hope of Metropolitan Maximus and the Archbishop and Metropolitan Halikias, who are all very hopeful for this to continue moving forward. There are numerous rites in the Catholic Church, I think 22 more or less recognized rites, equivalent to kind of our different jurisdictions, mostly geographically or socio-ethnic differences. And there are Eastern Catholic churches, Byzantine Catholic, there are Oriental Catholic churches, and so on. And the Eastern Catholic have been called Uniate churches, from the Slavic term unie. They're Orthodox in practice, but Catholic in theology. Now we have something similar. And those have been around for centuries, mind you, and there are some denominations or rites in the Catholic Church, the Maronite Church for about 1,600 years, the Melchior Church for several hundreds of years, the Byzantine Catholic throughout the history from the Kingdom of Poland to the reign of Russian Empire and such. These churches more or less went back and forth between Orthodox and Catholic for political reasons, protection. The Catholic Church had much more resources than the Orthodox Church did, and so they were able to offer protection to the Orthodox. And so that's why many came into the Catholic Church and they said, you can keep your customs, but you're under us. We have something similar, actually. Any of you ever hear about the Western Rite Orthodox Church? So we're just as guilty in the sense of saying, wait a sec, no, you can't have the Divine Liturgy and still be Catholic. We have a Western Rite, which in the U.S. is under the Antiochian Archdiocese. Bishop John of Worcester is the presiding bishop of this rite. And it looks exactly like a Catholic Mass, but they are Orthodox in theology and in jurisdiction. This developed mostly because of members from the Russian Exarchate in primarily France and other areas of Western Europe who wanted to kind of assimilate and have their local Catholic practices, but maintain their Orthodox theology and identity. And so in the western portion of the U.S., really from Texas onward, there's a very big population of Western Rite Orthodox who are coming in droves from either the Catholic Church or the Episcopalian Church. Many of the Catholics are saying we're sick of what Pope Francis is saying because he's too liberal for us, and so we want to become Orthodox, but we want to keep our Catholic Mass and some of our identifying factors. And so it is growing. I wouldn't say it would cause a schism in, let's say the GOA, but it is something to consider, the fact that if the population of mixed marriage keeps growing and it's not attended to in such a way, it could cause perhaps at least aggravation for people. There's some truth to this. The voice of the people is like the wrath of God. And this is often a concern. And I've been called by dear members of our Facebook page at the seminary a heretic because not only do I speak to other Christians, but I'm also part of a Christian-Muslim dialogue through the National Council of Churches. So I'm really seen as a bad guy. But the purpose of ecumenism is not to dismiss the differences that we have with all other churches. And it's important to note, the only church that we're looking to be fully in communion with or believe that we have the potential is with the Catholic Church. Because we were united with the Catholic Church at one time in history, and even pockets remained far beyond the schism. We don't believe that the schism was really 1054. That was the excommunication of the Patriarch to the Pope and the Pope to the Patriarch. It was an individual spat, and then the Church was just supposed to follow suit. Church historians will say the schism really happened in, some will say in 1204, when the Crusaders invaded Constantinople. Others will say, no, it happened in the 1430s, when the delegation from Constantinople went to the Council of Florence, asking for help with the impending Ottoman invasion, and they were forced to accept the Filioque and a couple, the Azimite controversy, a few other controversies from the Catholic Church, and then they left. The Ottomans invaded, and they said, well, we were under duress anyway. We didn't really accept these things. We just needed their help, because the Catholic Church had tremendous power at that point, socio-politically, And the Orthodox were understanding the impending threat of the Ottoman occupation, which later happened. So the purpose now of ecumenism, spanning outside of the Orthodox and Catholic Church, which we are called to be in communion because of our sacramental understanding and both being apostolic churches in such a way, is to simply have dialogue and recognize the other as a child of God. And so the role of ecumenism, which comes from really the time of the apostles through Acts, when the churches started popping up, and there were different customs, there were different practices, different liturgical practices. While we understand that the church at that time was one, factions started to happen very, very quickly, including heresies. And there are some churches that, in an ecumenical sense, Orthodox might not view as being legitimately church, big C church. We recognize that there's something church-y going on, but the term ecclesiology, which is kind of the study and understanding of what church constitutes, and that incorporates the sacraments and the historicity, the apostolic nature of the church, is seen to be radically different, or completely void in other churches. And there are many Protestant churches that we would say, those are not authentically church. They don't have the sacraments. Their leadership is non-existent. They broke off 30 years ago from another church because they didn't like their teaching. So we're not called to put aside our differences and say, you're right, you could come and become Orthodox and partake in our sacraments. No, we invite them to come, to pray with us and so on. We are encouraged through our canonical teaching and through the the Assembly of Bishops to engage in ecumenism for the role of building up the ecumeny, for building up the household of God. Not for breaking down barriers and saying, okay, I'm no longer Orthodox, you're no longer Pentecostal, we're the same now, or whatever other Protestant denomination. And we have guidelines for how to engage ecumenically, especially as clergy. What to wear, what we can say, what we can't say. And so we're never to treat it as if it is, let's say, concelebration, like if Father Anthony and I were to celebrate together. Everything has to take place outside the altar, or if we go to one of their churches, it can't be in what they might call the sanctuary. We're not to be vested, just to have our exodoso. We can pray with them, but there are set guidelines. And the people have a little more flexibility. You can pray with a friend if they're Catholic or Protestant at their church, while also understanding the limitations of participation, like one of the Taoists I'm part of. We're not trying to convert the Muslims, they're not trying to convert us. We know we're radically different, but we're trying to help break down things like Islamophobia, ignorance, hatred for the other, and there are people in our church that don't understand the differences, or don't understand as Christians how to relate to someone of a different faith. And on the other side, the same thing. Well, how do we refer to the Christians and such? How do we associate one with the other? If you didn't grow up in the Middle East, and you weren't in a predominantly Muslim environment as a Christian or Muslim, it's foreign. But since the 90s, and then especially after 9/11, and now, Muslims have been treated horribly in this country. And so it's a way of helping, as Christians, who have more of a strong foundation in the U.S., to support our brother and sister. We believe, too, they are children of God. And while they're not baptized and following as Christ taught us, that's really all we're called to do, just recognize the humanity in the other. Thank you all for listening.